We're live. Welcome to Music Matters with Jason Tramm. So great to have you here today, and thank you for joining our unique podcast community. We just hit 1,770 subscribers on YouTube. Thank you so much for helping us grow. Please remember to subscribe and smash that bell icon for the most up-to-date information on our upcoming guests and topics. Here on Music Matters, we explore innovation and self-discoveries made during challenging times with a range of artists from the classical world, from the contemporary world, and everything in between. Thank you for joining us on Music Matters. To see our over 250 past episodes, check out our website at www.jasontram.net. Again, that's www.jasontram.net. You can also see us on our social media platforms, on Twitter, Instagram, everything. We're all there. Our guest today is, I'm so excited to have Jan Swafford returning to Music Matters. Jan is one of the, I think, one of the most outstanding musical minds, an acclaimed composer whose music's been performed by the St. Louis Symphony, Indianapolis Symphony, Dutch Radio Orchestra, many, many other prestigious ensembles. He's also an acclaimed university professor at Boston Conservatory, and he's been at many other places as well, and an author who's written some of the most important books on Ives, Brahms, Beethoven, and Mozart in recent years. Also, our program notes that have been seen by the Boston Symphony, the Metropolitan Opera, and many, many others. So really an incredible mind, and I'm glad he's joining us again. Welcome, Jan.
Thanks, Jason, for all the nice stuff.
Well, yeah, we last time you were on, we talked for about an hour and a half, and it was such an interesting conversation. I'm fascinated by your combination of, practical composition, studying the masters. Did you find your studies of the masters helped your composition?
I'm finding that out now. I haven't found out yet because when I started writing books about people like Brahms and Beethoven, Mozart, I didn't compose that much, so I'm waiting to find out. How the muse feels about me these days and what I've learned from those guys. And I think I've learned quite a bit. But
I read both your Beethoven and your Mozart, and I'm starting the Ives, and the level of detail and research, and you're very, very, you're such a great prose writer. And we explored this last time, that you have a background in writing, and you have such a unique combination of skills.
Well, I don't claim to be a great writer, but I claim to be a very good writer for a musician, because musicians don't tend to be word people very much. And I think for a musician, I'm a pretty good writer. And that's about as far as I'm willing to go. I read the New Yorker every week so I can read writers who are better than I am.
Well, I'll disagree with you there. I love. There's some things I read some of these biographies, and I just can't get through them. It's like the Grout Poliska book. It's like watching grout dry, and I just find your writing very easy to assimilate.
I've always said that most books about music are written by musicians who can't write very well, very interestingly, or writers who don't know that much about music. And I claim to be somebody who knows a lot about music who can also write pretty well. To me, that's my particular thing.
And finding the balance in your career, how did you find that balance? Your teaching, your composition, and your writing, each which are...
I didn't. I'm sorry. I can't let you go on with that because I didn't. I basically stopped composing when I started writing, because I was at one point researching and writing a 1,000-page biography of Beethoven while working 1.5 teaching jobs. And there are people in the world who have the discipline to do that and also compose, but I don't.
You must feel some allegiance to Bernstein was always talking about how he never had enough time to compose because he was running around the world, leading the world's leading orchestras. And I guess that's how he must have felt.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a similar kind of thing. I mean, that there is a part of you that is scared of composing, scared of sitting down and doing it, because I think every artist who's honest is to some degree scared, because you don't really know quite how you do it or where it comes from. And I read a story about Laurence Olivier once. Somebody came back and said that was the most remarkable Othello I've ever seen. Why do you look so depressed? He said, I know it was, but I don't know how I did it. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to do it again. So, there are always great reasons to not compose. And having a book contract is a big one, and a teaching job.
Yeah.
But now I don't have anything to do but compose, and we shall see what happens.
Do you have anything on the burner? Any compositions, and do you have things that are waiting to be composed?
Yeah, I have an orchestra piece due for the Orchestra New England within a couple of years, and that gives me some focus. And I'd like to write some smaller things first to get back in gear. And so that's where I'm sort of at right now. And meanwhile, I'm copying an old orchestra piece of mine that I wrote many years ago for an orchestra.
Do you ever
And
revise any of your older works? Do you have any look back in your catalog? And
I'm a compulsive reviser. I revise all the time. I'm copying out this piece and making tweaks all over the place.
it's interesting.
Because you always get better ideas. You've always learned something.
Like, I'm fascinated. Beethoven was never set with he seemed to be revising things constantly. I'm always fascinated by it. Well, it seems like Mozart wrote so fast, and like even when you look at his manuscripts, they're like, it's like, how does the ink dry? And he was running on to the next. I mean, I'm just fascinated by that.
Well, it was not quite as fast as it seems because he did sketch more than people realize. We're talking about Mozart now. But his wife apparently threw away the sketches because she didn't think they were important.
Oh, no.
So he did write very fast, but the reality is everybody wrote. Nearly everybody who was great wrote very fast. Beethoven most of the time wrote incredibly fast. It's just that sometimes he took the time it took, whatever. If he got in trouble, he couldn't come up with something. And then he took the time it took. So you might see 10 sketches for something, but he might have done those 10 sketches in 2 hours. Mm. So the idea that Beethoven was struggling with everything he did and writing very slowly and painfully is not true at all.
Romantic accumulations, right? We love those kind of the shaking his fists at the gods kind of narrative.
And the idea that Mozart wrote it out in one draft, it was perfect, straight from God. It's not really true either. He had to stop and work things out sometimes, and he did revise. I remember looking at an exhibit at one point in a library. I had the manuscript of The Marriage of Figaro in my hands. I mean, that was an incredible experience.
Wow!
But on another occasion, I saw a page from it in a museum exhibition, and it was a page from Marriage of Figaro in the famous "Se vo ballare, signor Contino." And, that melody just seems like absolute unnatural. It was just born in one breath. But the fact is, there's a change in one note in the middle of the melody. And to change a note on the score in those days, you had to scrape out every single note with a knife all the way down the score and then redraw the staff lines. And that's how you changed a note. But he changed one note in the middle of that tune. That seems so perfect, and yet it wasn't until he changed that note.
It takes 300 years or so of listening to accumulation and to make it feel that way, I guess. It's been so ingrained in our consciousness. What's it like to hold a manuscript like that in your hand of one of the greatest works of art in our field?
It's indescribable. I held the manuscript of the Brahms German Requiem in my hand at another point. The Mozart was just kind of, I don't know how to describe it. It was a touchstone. I mean, what I saw in it, I knew already about it. You can see how he wrote arias. He would write out the vocal line and the bass part, and then bits and pieces of accompaniment. And he did that for two reasons: to get the continuity of the whole thing. And also, he had to get the singers the part as soon as possible. So he would just give them the vocal line, the bass part, and a good pianist could fill in the harmony. And the singers needed that. So, and you can tell that from different colors of things. So I already knew that. So in a way, I wasn't learning a lot from looking at the manuscript, but it was just a kind of shattering experience to have it in my hand.
The ghosts, the impact that piece of paper has had on the world is just so amazing.
Yes. These little pieces of paper. And I looked at some of I had manuscripts of little choral pieces he wrote in masses in Salzburg, and they were impeccable on the page. Just no changes, nothing. And some of these were when he was in his teens. I had and the German Requiem, the extraordinary thing about that. In the first place, as far as I know, nobody has really studied Brahms's manuscripts because he threw away his sketches, so they assume there's nothing to see, but there's actually a fair amount of work on the manuscripts. And if anybody's done a study of that, I don't know about it. And the Requiem, among other things, ink dried very slowly in those days. So when he made a mistake, he'd just smudge it out with his thumb and write right over it. So the German Requiem has his thumbprints literally all over it.
Wow.
I don't mean 10 times a page, but I mean here and there you see his thumb. And the end of the third movement, which is this big fugue over a pedal point, he originally scored it 2D, full orchestra all the way through. And then he realized, no, I want to build up to a full orchestra at the end of the fugue. So he just started scratching out, marking out whole stretches of scoring. And that's on the manuscript. And I don't know if anybody's ever studied that.
That's fascinating. I mean, boy,
Yeah.
these works are, just getting goosebumps just thinking about that. And do you have to wear gloves when you held them? And
no, I was at the Beethoven House in Bonn, and we were looking at I was with this group, and we were looking at the original of the Diabelli variations. This woman had it on the piano, and we were all leaning over, and she was turning the pages with a credit card. And I said, "You're not wearing gloves?" And she said, "Actually, no, because if you wash your hands, gloves are more dangerous because you can't get a hold of the pages easily, and you might break a piece of the page off." So she wasn't using, but she was turning the pages with a credit card.
That's fascinating. No finger ink, no finger oil on the page. That's good.
Well, here's something else, by the way, about Beethoven. I went to the Beethoven House once, and they set me up in front of a computer, and I was looking at the manuscript, not the original, but on computer, of the Beethoven Wallenstein Piano Sonata. Now, the reputation of Beethoven is that every page he wrote looks like a battlefield. With it's rough and raw and things are scratched out. That is clear copy. The Wallenstein is clear copy from beginning to end.
Oh.
There are very few changes on it. And the biggest mess or, messy part on it is he copied from one page to the next, he copied the same measure twice by mistake, and he scratched out the second. And I think that was the biggest thing on the manuscript. And so I went to a guy I know who is a Beethoven editor and has a ton of copies of the manuscripts. And we just started leafing through them. In reality, as most of his manuscripts are perfectly clear. But here's something you learn as a biographer. You're writing a biography of Beethoven or Charles Ives, and you want an example of their manuscript. You will go to the roughest thing you can find. You'll go to the Beethoven page that looks like a battlefield because that's the most interesting. And people think that's the most Beethovenian, but the reality is that relatively few of his pages look like that. Some of them do. There's the famous study that Lewis Lockwood did of the Opus 60, I think it is, cello sonata, where he wrote a whole new version of the development section of the first movement on top of the first version.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, wouldn't that be cool to hear what the original was supposed to be? That's just so fascinating.
It mostly had to do with who got what tune. That's really just what was distributed.
Revoicing, redistributing the voicing around.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's always fascinating to hear first attempts because there's so much to learn from that.
Oh, yeah. And clearly Beethoven and Brahms, and for that matter Mozart, didn't look at their manuscripts as any holy things. They were just practical things. They didn't really care what they looked like.
And they would probably, often I guess they would, before it goes to publication, they might change some of it as it comes out and they kind of rethink.
To a degree. I mean, once it's published, it's pretty much set in stone, though Debussy was a fanatical reviser, and he would show up at the Paris Opera with new things to do with Peleas all the time.
That must drive them crazy after you put all the work into it.
It probably did drive them crazy because when you correct something, when you change something in an orchestra score, you've got to go and change, this, but a lot of people don't, all the parts.
Wow.
And it's murder.
there's
Music
just a
is,
couple instances of mistakes making it into the parts that are still like widely distributed,
oh, sure.
and people just assume that that's correct, and they're actually wrong. It happens in operas all the time.
Well, I studied with a guy at Yale as a conductor and used to play horn at Bayreuth, Otto Werner Müller, and I think, or maybe he was assistant to Strauss or something like that, and he was finding mistakes in Wagner's orchestra parts in the Ring and the horn parts.
It's insane.
It is. Music is incredibly complicated to notate. I mean, I'm doing this orchestra piece of mine after Spring Rain. I'm putting it into the computer for the first time. And I just realized how I was driven nuts by all the nuances I put in. I'm always doing little crescendos, and they're just a page full of hairpins and dynamics and articulations, and it's enough to drive you insane. But one of my principles as a composer was from none other than Cary Grant. Cary Grant there's a lot of downtime on a movie set. He would walk around messing with stuff on the set. He would disarrange books. He would put some cigarettes in an ashtray. He would do all these things. And they said, "Why do you do that?" And he said, "Because 100 details add up to an impression." And that is one of my things that have made an enormous impression on me as a composer. 100 details add up to an impression.
That's powerful.
And yeah, and it's true of everything. It's true of writing too. And that's why, people say, "Why do you keep going over this stuff again and again and again when you have 5 changes in a page?" Well, if you read it over 7 times and you catch 3 or 4 things on a page, that adds up to something.
Yeah, it's the same with the conducting field. It's like rehearse it again, get the find that correct bowing, find the correct way of producing the sound that's in your head. It's never set.
It's never set. It's never done. But that's one of the great things about it, isn't it?
So it makes it such a fascinating endeavor. This is pursuit of perfection, right?
Yeah, knowing you'll never get there. And that is why it is so infinitely fascinating, and why, to me, composing is more interesting than writing, because in writing history or biography, you're dealing with fact. I mean, fact is not perfect, but you're still dealing with fact. That's what you have to work with, as best you can tell. And in art, you get to make it all up. You get to play God, and it's just so fascinating to be able to create a cosmos like that.
I guess we decided the act of creation, such a fascinating thing that even, after your lifelong pursuit of composition, musical study, writing, that, as you still approach, you're composing now actively, and how challenging it is to channel the muse even after a lifetime of activity and work.
Well, Mozart probably didn't feel this way, but I feel, and a lot of composers, a lot of artists feel, that you can't believe you can ever do it again. And you look at what you've done and you say, "How in the hell did I do that?" I just read something of William Faulkner. I've been reading a lot about him. He's sort of my main writer. And he just said at one point, "To do what I've done, I don't know where it came from."
That's fascinating. That, I guess like a Beethoven or Mozart, some of these greats, they just, but it is fascinating to consider.
Well, they had a different attitude about art than we do. We are still romantics in a way. We think it comes out of your guts. And to Mozart and Beethoven, they were exercising a craft for a living. And if they had fear of the page, they would have starved to death. So they didn't.
Good point. Very practical, right?
Yeah, and Mozart was not writing for the ages. Beethoven was, but he just had a particular ego and personality he was not intimidated by. He was the first person to talk about immortality and to be very aware that I'm writing things that might live forever. Mozart didn't think that way.
Did Brahms consider himself writing? He must have considered himself writing for the ages. What do you think?
Yeah, but he was very pessimistic about what was going to happen to his music after he died. But that's because he was pessimistic about everything.
Fry Albert Einstein. I'm working on Symphony No. 3 right now for a concert in March, and I'm just always It's always like such like it's holy scripture. I've already taken Brahms symphony. Like, here we go again. Okay, going toe to toe with one of the great masters. But it's always so rewarding to dig into those scores.
Well, I should send you after I wrote my Brahms book, I had a gig in Toronto with the conductor there. Now, as soon as I say something like that, I immediately forget their name. He used to play first violin in the Tokyo Quartet, and his name was. I know him well.
It'll come. We got a whole hour to chat. So.
And he wanted me to do a script basically for a kind of presentation on the Brahms' Third. And talking with him, he's a very, very brilliant musician and guy. I suddenly realized in the sort of back and forth that the Third Symphony is really very much about his life. People tend to think of Brahms as writing pure music that's not autobiographical. He never claimed that himself. He didn't like to hear about it, but he was occasionally quite forthcoming about where these things came from. And if you realize the Third Symphony starts with a theme from Robert Schumann, from Schumann's Rhenish Symphony. And that symphony was written on the banks of the Rhine. He was thinking about that period in his life. And Peter Ungen is who I'm talking about. And he and I were talking, and I realized that Brahms was thinking back on that period in his life when he was discovered by Robert, and then Robert broke down, ended up in an asylum. Brahms fell in love with his wife, and it was a kind of glorious, horrendous, marvelous mess. And he was clearly in this piece, I think, thinking back on that time, because he had picked up Robert Schumann's habit of using musical letters to represent people. He had a Clara theme, Robert did, which Brahms used. And there's what you were saying, the FA Freihaber Einsam, which was Joachim's thing. Some people say Freihaber Froh is Brahms' FAF in the Third Symphony. I don't so much buy that, actually.
Okay, interesting.
But here's the thing: when Robert Schumann used his Clara theme, Clara was there. She was there in the music, alive in the music. And Brahms used these things the same way. And when he started writing the Third Symphony, I'm quoting Robert, the Rhenish Symphony, Robert is there. And I don't think the whole piece is a step-by-step programmatic piece, because Brahms didn't do that. But he's saying, I'm writing this piece on the banks of the Rhine. I'm using Robert's theme. Robert is here. Robert is present. And so is Clara, of course. And then that fantastic coda at the end of the piece, the coda of the finale, where for the first time you hear that theme from the opening again, but now it's descending in horn fifths. Da-dum, bum, ba-da-dum, sinking down. And the thing is that da-da-da-dum in horn fifths is the opening of the Beethoven Farewell Sonata. And what Brahms is doing in this is saying, Robert, farewell.
Wow.
And that whole period of my life, which was great and terrible, farewell. This is my piece to remember and say goodbye to that.
The composer gets to create a whole universe, right?
Yeah.
And
I think that aspect informs the whole piece, though I don't think it's a program piece, step by step at all. It's just because Brahms didn't do that. But, and to realize that and realize how personal that was. And many people feel it's his greatest symphony. I don't know.
I love the sixth. I love the fourth, and between the fourth and the third, I'm like, boy, I can't. It's like which child? I have 4 children. Which one do you like the best? Yeah. So it's the same thing. It's like different.
The first to me is so personally important. It was, I sort of became a musician over that piece.
Beethoven's 10th, right?
Yeah.
He certainly felt the weight, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. And some people say, I mean, I heard a Brahmsian say at one point the Third Symphony is Brahms's real first. Um, anyway, so we're
So let's
really
take a.
wandering here. We were talking about,
Oh,
thinking about some sort of meditations on what's happened in composition since the 50s. Um, what do you think about
well,
trying
I'm
that?
always fascinated. I grew up in the conservatory around the '90s, and my teachers were all serialists at the time, and they were all coming out of that training in that school. But we're seeing so much of the rediscovery of minimalism and tonality kind of reinvented. And it seems to be like now it's everywhere, right? I mean, like every film score is going to be using minimalist elements. Every film score is going to, it's like it's penetrated the mainstream in such an interesting way.
Except I think a lot of what's happening with tonality is not being reinvented, it's just being rehashed. I think sometimes, but that's my, as a composer, I get to be picky. I'm very picky. Um, but to look back at the 50s, I'm going to sort of end up with an anecdote here. But, there were two schools in the 50s. Which were serialism and Stravinsky and neoclassicism, and that's what dominated the musical scene, musical creativity. By the way, when I was researching the Ives biography, going through all these books of material, Ives kept scrapbooks of clippings about every composer, everything he found in the New York Times and elsewhere. He tracked the career. People think of Ives as very isolated. He was not isolated at all. He was tracking the careers of everybody.
Interesting.
And I read a lot of reviews of Stravinsky neoclassic music, and I have never read such bad reviews in my life. They were brutal. I think a lot of people felt that Stravinsky had led the way to the future with the Rite of Spring and then betrayed his own, with the neoclassicism, betrayed his own revolution.
Maybe he took the shocking aspect as far as he could, and it's time to try another avenue.
Well, yeah, or he simply ran out of ideas in that direction because, um, excuse me, uh, he he sort of retreated to the past in a way, and he didn't come out of it, but for a long time, and he was just excoriated for it. I mean, these were the most insulting reviews I've ever read in my life, and they were in Ives' scrapbooks. Not because he was rejoicing in Stravinsky's, he was just keeping an eye on what was going on. Anyway, so there were those two camps, and then Schoenberg died. And Schoenberg had been very scornful about Stravinsky, even though they were friends when they were younger. They would hang out together. And as soon after he died, Stravinsky suddenly started writing because he got involved with Robert Kraft, who had been known Schoenberg. And Stravinsky started writing serial music, and it's as if the commanding general went over to the other side.
Yeah,
And it shook composition to its core. And it really created the triumph of serialism, especially in the academy. Now, remember that Schoenberg, when he invented the 12-tone method, felt that he was creating a new standard technique to replace tonality. He felt that he said this would dominate music for the next century. This is the way people would write music. It's the new technique. Well, it didn't work because not enough people bought tickets.
It certainly worked in the academic sense. It didn't work in the
Yes.
audience perception technique.
Well, that's it. When Stravinsky started writing serial music, that was the triumph. And a lot of people who had been writing neoclassic stuff lost their jobs in academia, or they were shunted aside. And that was the situation for a long time. There was a period when if you were in college to be a composer, if you were considered to be serious, you would be writing serial music. That was the assumption. And I remember I was studying composition with this guy in Boston in about 1967 or so. And I walked in once. He used to play me music a lot, which I think is a good thing for composition teachers to do. And he said, "I'm going to play you something." And he put the needle on the record. And I just stood there with my mouth hanging open. It was the Terry Riley in C. one of the first big minimalist pieces, and I'd never heard anything like that before, and I was absolutely thunderstruck. Um, and I, what I and minimalism, I think, triumphed, and not triumphed, but it the star rose very fast because I think for not particularly good reasons. It has a good beat, and any 4-year-old can understand it.
Certainly, if you get the
Yeah, you can
patterning.
understand it. You can follow it. It's inescapable. But what it did was to flee as absolutely far as possible from academic serialism, where even a steady pulse was often verboten. And what I think minimalism did is a great favor to all creative music is to open up everything in the middle. Suddenly everything was up for grabs. Now, what it meant that things were suddenly chaotic, and they've been chaotic ever since. The arts are chaos right now. They're anarchy because there is no standard technique for anything. There's no assumptions about anything.
It seems like the currency is originalism, but how is it? It must be so hard to be original today and to find a voice.
You can't in the way that it used to be. Let me just think if I finish my point about minimalism, because I just to tell you, I don't like most minimalism at all. I still like NC because I'm very nostalgic about it, and that piece to me is like a Vermont hillside and a pretty girl enjoying. I mean,
Gotcha.
it's delightful, and I think I was writing recently that I've been listening again. I've heard it many times to music. Steve Reich Music for 18 Musicians, and I said, to me, this is the great masterpiece of minimalism. Wait a minute, it's the only masterpiece for me. But
I'll fight you on that. During COVID, when times were the hardest, or when I was writing my 10-year dossier, which took me a billion hours. Anyway, it felt like it at least. I would put on Arvo Pärt, and I think Arvo Pärt, to me, I just love, like, it's just, there's something timeless about his like sacred minimalism, his like incorporating church music with minimalism. For some reason, it just grabs my attention.
well, I haven't listened to much Parrot, and I probably, I might very well be honest, but he's not an American minimalist. He's not a rock and roll guy. I spent a whole afternoon with Terry Riley once, who was just the most marvelous guy. He's sort of an old hippie, basically. And I said, "So where did this come from, Terry?" I said, we were listening to a lot of rock and roll and smoking a lot of dope." He was, and so anyway, things became much more open then. I had a couple of lessons with Toru Takemitsu, and he didn't speak English very much. But he just said at one point, he said, "We free now." And he said what he meant was we're free to do whatever we want, and we're free of ideology. Not everybody is, but
Now,
I'm going to return now to something that you brought up, and now I forgot what that was. Where I said I was going to finish that thought, and then you had a new thought. Do you remember what it was?
I don't. Well, I'm just so fascinated by this discussion of minimalism and where it's going. I just think that there's this kind of reinvention of tonality, bringing it back. And I'm doing the Chichester Psalms with my college choir, one of my choral societies, and I just love that piece. I've done it a bunch of times. And Bernstein talks about starting to think in serialistic terms and kind of combating this. And he returns back to that style with his its own two-tonal feet or something like that. He wrote it in the Times or something like that. It's just interesting to me how everyone's had to wrestle with the effects of serialism and what it means, and to be a serious composer. And it's just fascinating to me that, and you've lived through that. Obviously, you've taught conservatory and acted as a composer.
Taught serial technique but I've never written a serial piece.
Have you ever incorporated serialistic elements in your compositions?
Yes. The one piece, and it's one of my interesting pieces. It won a prize. It was played in Europe for 6 trumpets.
Interesting.
And this is what's serial about it, because serial just means you have a pattern that you follow. So I wrote 6 chords for 6 trumpets. That I said that's going to be the end of the piece, and the rest of the piece is going to be based on those 6 chords in various permutations, and I just kept transposing and permuting them, and that's in effect a serial technique. And that's the closest I've ever come, but I've never done one. I've never used a row, for example, even though, I've studied it and taught it. And partly because I don't like most serial pieces except by Schoenberg. And I'm very cranky about this. I love what we call the free atonal Weber and pieces like 5 pieces for string quartet, 6 pieces for orchestra, which I think is just a stunning, heartrending, fantastic piece. I don't like his 12-tone pieces. To me, when he started doing what I call playing mahjong with notes, he got less expressive and less interesting. And I love Berg's Wozzeck. I don't much like Lulu. It's also because I don't like the people in it. But I think Berg thought femme fatales were deep, and they're not.
Got a great story. I was my friend was singing in Moses and Aaron, Schoenberg's Moses and Aaron, and I was downstairs having lunch with some of the musical staff at the Met cafeteria, and the cast for The Merry Widow was sitting there. They said that they've been tuning for 3 hours.
Well, here's a story. The first big-time professional big city opera I ever saw was Sarah Caldwell's Moses and Aaron, which is an absolute legendary production. And it blew me across the room and down the street. I mean, I just boggled. I think I saw it 3 times. And you would think that after that, I would immediately become a serial composer, but I still didn't. That's not what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do at that point, but I knew I didn't want to do that. And that was when I was a freshman at Harvard. Absolutely wet behind the ears green kid from Tennessee, from Chattanooga. But anyway, so after minimalism came in, so many things become possible. I'm one of those people who's worked in the middle. I'm absolutely not ideological about either tonality or atonality. I've written atonal music, I've written tonal music, and it just depends on how the ideas are running and what the purpose is and what I'm trying to say. I have a piece that I'm going to use the basic idea again sometime. It's for strings, piccolo, and percussion, and it was, played by St. Louis, and it was played by in Holland. The first 2.5 minutes are all 12 notes all the time, but they're arranged in a pattern of fifths in the strings. And it sounds, and basically the piece just shifts around within a 12-note chord. It sounds like tonal chord changes. And I was fascinated by that. That's what fascinated me about that idea. So it doesn't sound particularly dissonant at all. It sounds kind of like, some of the arrangements are more dissonant than others. That's what it amounts to.
Interesting. I guess it's
how it's used,
how it's structured.
That's where I work. That's what I work in. Now what?
I guess how it's used, structured, the elements. I mean, the free atonality is very hard for the audience to understand. I teach a lot of non-majors. I teach kind of a survey course, and I really enjoy it because I'm like, these styles. Even people who aren't musicians and have no musical background, they'll know them in film scores. They'll know Stravinsky's kind of rhythmic sense. They'll know the expressionistic school because you hear it in horror movies. Hollywood, lesser composers
not only in
freely
horror
adapt.
movies anymore. I mean, Johnny Greenwood, his score for the new Jane Campion Power of the Dog is a fabulous, subtle, very low-key music score that's, in effect, avant-garde. I mean, he's using an out-of-tune piano, among other things. It's marvelous. And I gather he had an undergraduate composition degree, and he used some kind of Penderecki-like stuff in There Will Be Blood. And those are not horror movies, they're dramas. And I think people are more used to a varying range of sounds now because of movies. And that's why I think Bartók gets more applause now than he used to. And I heard a standing ovation 20 years ago for the Schoenberg Piano Concerto played by Mitsuko Ushida at the BSO.
Wow.
And this is a good thing. I mean, this is a very good thing.
Yeah, sometimes I guess it takes time for the top of the repertoire to rise to the top. It takes perspective historically.
Yes. Well, sometimes you've just brought up a whole other big issue. We tend to believe that radical ideas in all the arts take a long time to be absorbed. It's not true. And in music, one of the reasons people believe that is a book called Lexicon of Musical Invective by Nicholas Slanimsky, which is a lexicon of bad reviews from the last music reviews of the last 200 years, bad reviews of great pieces. And that book, and he says in the introduction that it takes 20 years for an innovative masterpiece to make its point. And that's what everybody believes in that book. In fact, what everybody tends to believe, having read that book, is that great innovative works of music only get bad reviews. I had a collection of Beethoven symphonies that I carried, scores that I carried around with me all the time when they were in my trombone case at all times when I was a teenager. That's how much of a nerd I was. And there's some reviews at the beginning of it. It was one of those scores called arrow scores that has little arrows that point to the tune.
Nice.
I don't know if you remember those.
I've never seen those. Very helpful.
Yeah, if you don't know what you're doing. They had some reviews of each of the Beethoven symphonies at the beginning, and they were all bad. So that was people's impression. It's absolute nonsense. Yes, Beethoven, I mean, I'm going to say two things about the great revolutionary pieces of music. Things like Beethoven's Eroica, the Third Symphony, Stravinsky Rite of Spring, Schoenberg Pierrot Lunaire. Yes, there was a lot of incomprehension when Beethoven's Third was premiered. 2 years later, the leading music magazine in Europe said this is the greatest symphony ever written. Yes, there was a riot at the premiere of the Rite of Spring, but that had more to do with the choreography than did with the music. And if you've ever seen the reconstruction of that choreography by Nijinsky, it is shocking beyond belief. Still,
I show it to my students. It's on YouTube. I'm like, you have to watch this. Like, that's as much to do with it as the harmonies, which are great and shocking. But this is really the kind of the angular, non-balletic kind of motion.
Yeah, it's anti-balletic is what it is. I mean, people jumping up and down and coming in on their heels. I mean, it's outrageous. I think it's marvelous. I love it. Anyway, the year after that riot, Stravinsky there was a performance in Paris of the riot as a concert piece, and Stravinsky was carried through the streets of Paris on the shoulders of a cheering crowd. And not long after that, it was in a Disney cartoon. So the idea that revolutionary pieces take a long time to settle in is a myth. It has happened. Ives was not appreciated for a very long time, but he wasn't part of the musical world. He wasn't out there, getting his stuff played and performing and, because he was an invalid.
He was so far ahead of his time with his when I look at like the Psalm 90, when he was writing that, I'm like, it was so crazily, I'm just fascinated that he could be that far ahead, like that prophetic.
I think he started that or drafted, sketched it as a teenager, and it's astonishing. It's a beautiful, beautiful, unique piece. It also shows that he had a hell of an ear. I mean, Stravinsky said at one point, he said, I look at Berg and Schoenberg and their stuff is so theoretical. All I had when I wrote the Rite was an ear. And he had an incredible ear, because the consistency of harmonic language in that piece is stunning and absolutely sui generis. There'd never been anything like it.
His choice of timbres is so incredibly original, and still teaches me to this day. Every time I kick out that score, I'm just like, wow. It's just so incredibly brilliant.
I remember once, in another way I was going to study, I decided, I think the greatest masters of orchestration were Stravinsky, Mahler, and Ravel, and Debussy.
Yeah, I was going to say Debussy. Can't forget Debussy.
Yeah. And I decided I'm going to study Das Lied von der Erde, the orchestration, and I just could barely get past one page because it's so complex. Timbrely. And I haven't done enough study of orchestration, I have to say. I've studied notes a lot, but I haven't studied orchestra enough. So anyway, here's my, in a way, what I was going to say to summarize when we go back to that point about how is music developed. There is no standard technique. There are no assumptions. Some people are ideological, but really there is no going ideology. the piece by Carolyn Shaw that won the Pulitzer for, a few years ago for Roomful of Teeth, her vocal group, I think, is a marvelous piece, and it has elements of music from the last 200 years in it. And it just absolutely effortlessly and effectively combines all those things. And I used to teach in a conservatory that had 35 student composers, 5 faculty composers. And every single one of those students and teachers wrote in a different way. No two people wrote the same way. There were no serialists. There were no mainline minimalists. And yet, serialism, minimalism, tonality, atonality, all those things were circulating in all that music in unpredictable and very interesting ways, chaotic and anarchistic, but interesting ways. And what I think, I'm going to make 2 points. One is that what a composer has to do these days is there's the rubble of all previous systems and ideologies lying around the ground. And you walk around and you pick up pieces of one thing and another, and you cobble them together into a language and a voice. And I don't think there's any other choice but to do that. And the reason I think there's no other choice is, and this all came out of something that Alban Berg said once. He said, soon it will be possible to write a chord of 12 notes. Now, he and Schoenberg shared this Germanic historical view of music, that history had a logic and they were vehicles of history. Schoenberg always said, I am who I am because I had to be. If it wasn't me, it would be somebody else because I am the historical moment. This is where music history had to be at this moment. Well, I think this is all baloney. I think the whole Germanic attitude toward history is baloney. But, and what Berg was saying was, it's not the historical moment yet to write a 12-note chord, but soon it will be, which is, to me, just nuts. Why didn't you just do it? Just do it.
Anyway. Who said that they'll be singing Erwartung in the streets? Who was that? Was that Schoenberg's quote?
Schoenberg may have said something like that. He once said, I think I'm just a sort of a better Tchaikovsky, which is extraordinarily delusional. And I'm an admirer of Schoenberg. Mind you, I'm not putting down Schoenberg, though he's not warm and fuzzy. I'm more of a Bartok and Stravinsky guy. Anyway, there was a sense, part of the thing about Berg, there was a sense of possibilities to be discovered. There were a sense of new horizons, harmonically and so forth, in terms of harmony and complexity and so forth and so on, new kinds of color. There aren't anymore. As soon as a 12-note chord was used, which was in the 40s at least, if not earlier, as soon as somebody used white noise in a composition, and white noise is theoretically all pitches sounding at the same time, there is no more possible harmonic density than that. So that's the end of harmony. You can't make new discoveries in harmony in the sense of expanding things. Can't be done. There are not really any new discoveries in melody to be made, I don't think. In color, there could be new colors in the orchestra, but that may be more flexible, and maybe the possibilities of color are much more variable, but so many things have been done. What I'm getting at is the sense of that you can write something that is revolutionary and completely sui generis new, like in some ways the Eroica was, in some ways Rite of Spring was, in some ways Perrault Lunaire was. I just don't think it's possible anymore. And that's why when I was at Yale in graduate school and everybody in all the arts was running around trying to be little revolutionaries, I just said, this is ridiculous. It in the first place in music, it's hardly possible. And there were other people in music writing music as if they were German composers in Vienna in 1915 because they considered it nothing but a technical feat. And I said, that's ridiculous too, because it pretends that music has nothing to do with the life around it and the personality of the people involved, and that's ridiculous. Of course it has everything to do with where you are and what's surrounding you. So I kind of rejected a lot of the tenets of modernism at that point without rejecting techniques of any particular kind. Anything is useful, anything expressive is expressive. Um, so I think we're in a, I mean, look at visual arts where people are making tens of millions of dollars, artists, because art is now an investment that's indulged in by rich people. And that is a corruption, I think, beyond description. But it's what it is.
We get commercial arts and all this. Yeah, it's. I look at some of these paintings that sell, and I'm just stunned. Like, that's worth what?
And not just paintings, but anything. I mean, you can. I've seen political slogans written in cardboard and rough crayon, and in a big museum, and I just think that's appalling. But and I remember seeing at the Museum of Modern Art, there's a famous guy, I can't remember his name. His art was to have himself shot, and there were a series of photographs. And here was the guy, the artist standing there, was the guy smiling with a rifle, and the artist was taking off his shirt, and they were shaking hands. And you saw the guy aiming at he was supposed to wing him on the arm. And he actually wounded him fairly badly.
Yikes, what a terrible idea.
The next to last picture is the artist screaming and writhing on the ground, holding his arm. And the last picture was a picture of the check he got for this. And this was about 1969.
If that was today, it could be called #terrible idea.
No, this guy's famous for that. I should know his name. He had himself nailed to a car roof at one point. I mean, that was his art. There was a famous young German artist whose art was cutting off parts of his body with razor blades, which he did until he died. And that's why I say the arts are chaos and anarchy right now, which is sort of okay with me because I'm a bit of an anarchist. I call myself an anarchist classicist because I kind of like anarchy, but as on the classicist part of me wants to be very particular and succinct about things.
Now, I interview a lot of contemporary artists, and I've had a lot of punk rock bands on the show, especially like and they're coming at, like, this is of course a hard veer left, but this kind of anarchy and exploring society. What do you think about the contemporary music's kind of? You were talking about Terry Riley, and he was a rock and roll guy and kind of approached it from that way. What do you think about contemporary music's kind of crossover into Western art music?
I'm skeptical of most of it because I believe in integrity. I think you should be what you are. I mean, I have no trouble with pop music. But it's a very up in the. I kind of want pop music to be what it is and classical music to be what it is, but still open to cross fertilization in various ways. But pop music to me is not very interesting musically. It's a few chords. I mean, how many times in your life can you hear a backbeat and it's interesting? And I hear the same damn chords, and I just don't find it musically very interesting, which doesn't mean I hate all of it. It's just very, very little that I like. And what I like is, like most people, is what I liked when I was, 20 years old, 16, 20 years old. I was fascinated by the Beatle documentary recently because I thought it was an extraordinary picture of the creative process. Have you seen that?
I have not. I'll check that out, though.
I'll recommend it highly. You see, and they're trying to do something. It's ridiculous. They're trying to put together a whole album from scratch in 2 weeks, and it didn't work. And I think they cut a lot of corners, and I don't think what came out was Let It Be, I guess. And I don't think it's their best album, though it's got some great stuff on it. But among other things, you see Paul, they're kind of desperate to get stuff done. And you see Paul sitting there playing his bass guitar, strumming it. And he's sort of doing it, and gradually what you hear is Get Back start to happen out of gibberish, musical and verbal gibberish. Get back. It's absolutely, it's an astounding thing. And I don't think Get Back is the greatest thing in music or rock and roll either, but it's a nice little tune, and to watch the germ of it being created in front of your eyes is extraordinary. And also to realize their professionalism, what chops they had, their ability to just snap into a style and a voice on a dime. Even if they're improvising, it's a real piece. It has a shape. It has a personality.
That moment where it all gels together. I mean, we're seeing, obviously, in the symphonic world and the Western art world, we're all coming to terms with that because we're trying to, the producers are trying to get market share. They're trying to bring people into the audience. So we're seeing more and more, films played by the New York Philharmonic with a movie in the background. And we're seeing so much of that these days. So there is this cross-pollination, but it's kind of like forced.
I think a lot of it is forced. I remember a great favorite of mine was Nusrat Ali. What is it? Nusrat Ali Khan. I think there's another name in there somewhere. He was an Eastern musician, fabulous singer, and his last stuff was kind of poppy and crossover, and it's just not as interesting. And something like Balinese music, which is a great favorite of mine. I want it to stay what it is, and yet I realize that's a kind of an art can't stay frozen in time, so it's a complicated thing. It really is. I want Balinese music to be what it is and stay that way, but of course, in a way, it can't. But I want it to have its integrity as what it is, and I want pop music to have its integrity in those cases when it does. I mean, mostly it's just commercial, and it's the victory of show over content, of style over content, and image over content. But the stuff in it that's pretty good and interesting, I just want it to be what it is and not try. But it's complicated. Does that mean I object when the Beatles use a Bach trumpet? No, or a harpsichord? No. I think that enriched their stuff tremendously.
And
I wish the Beatles had got. Yeah, what?
It introduced it to probably a lot of people who never heard those instruments before, who may have been intended to say, "Oh, let me check that out." So
it could be just like I
the
read.
Gateway drug
to
Western music.
I got interested in Proust's Remembrance of Things Past because it was a standing joke on Monty Python.
So it's interesting how mass culture can kind of lead to a different path.
It can, but then we think about Duke Ellington, who to me was one of the great composers of the 20th century and who integrated composition and improvisation in a unique way. But when he started writing kind of quasi-classical longer pieces at the end, I don't think they're as good. And that's because it wasn't his thing. It wasn't his tradition. It wasn't the way he thought. He was forcing himself to do something that he didn't do as well. For that matter, Schubert, one of the greatest natural geniuses ever born, spent a lot of his life writing opera. He wrote over 10 operas, and they're not performed because they're not very good. He didn't have a gift for that.
He was better in short forms.
Yes, he was.
The best, in fact. His art songs are little planets in themselves.
Yeah, they are. Starting as a teenager. I mean, he wrote more significant and original stuff as a teenager, much more so than Mozart.
I tell my undergraduates, they come in, I'm like, just so you know, no matter how good you are, Schubert wrote Erlkönig when he was 17.
Yeah, exactly.
Good luck.
And I think Gretchen am Spinnrad too. And these are two of the greatest songs
ever written. Yep, I agree.
So it's all complicated and you can't make hard and fast rules, but I do believe in an idea of integrity. And I think most commercial music doesn't have much integrity, but there are people who do. I mean, the Rolling Stones have their own integrity. The Beatles certainly had their integrity. I mean, there are people who do.
Rolling Stones, I was reading a thing with Mick Jagger about his routine. He studies ballet, modern dance. He runs marathons. He's out there. He has said, I have to be in the absolute top shape to give the show that I give to my audience. That's his level of discipline.
I can believe it. I knew sort of. I didn't know he did all that. I knew he worked out a lot when they were getting ready to tour. I can believe
crazy.
That.
And he's got to be close to definitely mid-70s, probably closer to 80.
Yeah, I think he probably is. Yeah. Are they still doing live stuff?
Yeah, right before COVID, my brother saw him play and saw this Rolling Stones. Yeah, it was right before COVID, so that was a couple of years ago. And I bet they're going to go on the road again, even to replace Charlie Watts, rest in peace, the drummer.
Yeah. who was mostly who made me consider himself a jazz drummer, by the way.
He
To
played
me,
very understated rock drummer.
yeah, he did. Yeah, he was. One of my big disappointments with the Beatles, just to say, is that they never got into jazz, and they, for all the influences they had, I think Lennon actively disliked jazz. But if they'd gotten involved in it, that would have been. I mean, they were into Baroque music, and as Paul said, I was into experimental music, and they were into Stockhausen, but there's a certain amount of British music hall in their stuff. All these influences and voices and genres and elements, and they never got jazz into it, which is too bad. That would have expanded them still more.
Given them so much more vocabulary harmonically and some free form. Yeah,
Yes.
that was interesting.
Yeah.
And jazz being one of the biggest, it's one of our big cultural exports. Jazz, and R&B, like blues.
And jazz has been kind of lost the race with rock and roll, which is very tragic and sad. And there's so many reasons for that. Partly because rock is just easier, and you can dance to it, and it's easier to absorb. But also, jazz. At what point does jazz extend itself so far instead of free? I'm thinking of free jazz in the '60s, where it really is barely jazz anymore. And that's a big question. Has jazz sort of reached the end of its potential development? Was bebop the end of what was really new and fresh and original in jazz?
I guess we can say the same thing about Western art music too. It's like, how far can we go? What's the next chapter going to look like?
I think Western art music is infinitely flexible in that respect. I don't think there's a point where you can say this is no longer Western art music because it's so huge. Whereas jazz is different. I'm saying jazz is different in that respect. Jazz is a particular tradition, whereas classical Western music is everything from, Gregorian chant to absolute madness, chaos, and everything in between. And it's all. It can all be.
What I love about the tradition now, when I say that it keeps on expanding, is we keep on including Eastern elements and new cultural elements, some African, different composers bring different things to the tradition, and it keeps expanding in different directions. So it is infinite. It's fascinating.
I'm very much involved in Indian music and Balinese music, not as a performer, just as a listener, but they're very much a part of my music, though you would rarely realize that that's what's going on. And so is blues, by the way, and jazz. You would not usually realize that either. But here's what I do believe. I'll make a blanket statement here. What is still unique in music and what is still possible and what is still necessary is voice. I'm going to make 2 points actually that are distinct because we're talking about composition in general. I think as a composer, if you don't have a voice that is noticeable as yours within 10 or 15 seconds, you're not going to last. You hear the beginning of any Stravinsky piece, you instantly know it's him, with a few exceptions maybe. Mozart and Haydn less so, though if you know their music well, you'd know it. When I was young, I had trouble telling the difference between them. Everybody does, but when you learn more, they're very distinct. I remember Anthony Lane, the movie critic of The New Yorker, once with a friend, he said his friend had never seen, he knew there was a particular movie by Hitchcock that his friend had never seen, so he decided to put on the movie and see how long it took him to guess who it was, who directed it, and it took him 10 seconds. And that's what I mean by a voice. And every great composer has it. And as much as Stravinsky changed, you hear a few bars of The Rite of Spring, you hear a few bars of Petrushka, you hear a few bars of his, more conservative pieces like Pulcinella, you instantly know it's him. So that's one thing. I'll tell you here's the other thing to get back to what we were talking about a half hour ago about revolution. And this is not what they taught you in school. I'm telling you, all the great revolutionary pieces had to do with expressing a non-musical idea. The original name of Beethoven's Eroica was Bonaparte. It was a piece about Napoleon. And that the entire nature of that piece, the way it's put together, everything about it, the gestures, the form, the harmonies, everything has to do with expressing an idea about Napoleon and about heroism in general. Just like the Pastoral Symphony is all about a visit to the country, and everything about it, the melodies, the harmonies, the form, everything about it is about a visit to the country. Pierrot Lunaire was a gig that Schoenberg got as a commission. And he decided to write a melodrama, which is a traditional musical idea. Mozart was familiar with this. You're reciting poetry to music, with music. And all Schoenberg did was to say, I want to notate the voice part precisely, including rough pitches, so it'll be more integrated to the music, which was just a logical thing to do. And I want to express these very strange poems. So he developed a musical language to just, to these bizarre, absolutely bizarre poems, and they expresses them perfectly. And Rite of Spring was about a primitive, a ceremony, a dance to death in primitive Russia, primal Russia. These are all extra musical ideas, and the music was created to express and convey that idea, and that is what made them revolutionary. It's not a matter of just technique. The techniques were developed to express the idea, and that is not what they teach you in school. They teach it backwards. They say innovation is purely a technical matter. It's not.
That's so
it involves
powerful.
Technique. But it is not a matter of technique. It's a matter of finding something new, a new way to say something about something that's never been said before about something else.
What's fascinating is the way that everyone else who tries to adapt those techniques is just rehashing something that was done originally for that one idea.
Yes.
And some composers try to do it again, and it doesn't work as well, obviously, a second time.
And I think especially student composers, because they're taught that it's a technical feat, so they say, okay, here's how you write 12-tone music, therefore this is what I'll do. But, the Schoenberg's 12-tone music is not like other people's, because he was Schoenberg, and because he grew up in Vienna and the fin de siècle, and because this, that, and the other, because he may have been very interested in cocaine. That may have been part of it too.
It's just fascinating to see if Schoenberg also was a great composer in the post-romantic style too, before crossing over. So he had that, and he could do.
He came out of that.
His proportions and orchestrations were brilliant, and he had that before the rest happened.
Yeah, I think part of 12-tone for him was a way of making sure that his previous late romantic self couldn't step in. It's not allowed. It forced him into a new place, which I think is something that artists need to do sometime. You just like Picasso could draw like nobody's business, but sometimes a lot of his painting is about looking as if he can't draw. It's very childlike sometimes, but he sort of forbade himself to do slick drawing, which he was tremendously capable of. So these are, art is, and to come back to something, if the kind of revolution that we associate with pieces like the Eroica and the Rite of Spring are not possible anymore, and I don't think they are. What is possible is to be yourself. And, I consider myself a chameleon as a person, a composer, and a writer. I have very different voices sometimes. I wrote music for Greek plays. A friend of mine did some productions of Greek plays that he translated. And I came up with a musical style that was unlike anything I'd ever done before. I said, I want to create something that sounds like it could have been written any time in the last 2,000 years.
Gives you a lot of flexibility, a lot of rope.
Yeah. But that doesn't sound like my chamber music. And I think it's good for artists to be put in a position sometimes. My first big orchestra piece, it's the piece for Chattanooga Symphony. I'm recopying it now. My mother had sent my music, I was still in graduate school, to the conductor of the Chattanooga Symphony. And I had a summons from him at Christmas when I was home. And I walked in expecting he was going to play one of my pieces that my mother sent him. And first thing he said was, if I play any of these pieces, I'll be ridden out of town on a rail.
Never what a composer wants to hear.
No. But he said, I want to commission you to write a piece for the 50th anniversary of the orchestra. And what he didn't say, but what I understood him to say, was don't write something like these pieces that you sent me. Find something else. And I did. And it doesn't sound like any of my other music at that time, but it's me all the same.
Where can people go to hear your music? And they may have read your books, or where could they go to hear your music?
Well, my best piece and the best performance I ever had in my life is on YouTube. So there it is. And I'm going to put more of my music on YouTube pretty soon. It's something I've been not getting around to.
Now, Jen, do you have a YouTube channel that under your name?
I attempted to make one, but I didn't succeed because I don't know how to do it.
Well, if you need any help, my son is a gifted at doing that. So we'll be, if you ever need help.
Let's be in touch. I tried. That's a piece that is about, it's called They That Mourn. It's a memorial for 9/11. And I had already started the piece when 9/11 happened. It was a commission for anniversary of a chamber group in Harrisburg. And when 9/11 happened, I was literally working on the piece that day. And I'd already written the beginning. And I said, do not try to make this piece about that because it's too big, it's too soon, you can't do that. But it happened anyway, it just took over the piece. So, and the beginning I'd already written was absolutely appropriate to that, so it was kind of prophetic. Pieces are always, Schoenberg said he couldn't imagine a piece of music that wasn't about something. And I think he meant not about technique. I don't think that's what he meant. I think he meant about emotion. I think the violin concerto, for example, is about the Second World War. I just see it as an allegory of the war. It's
music without emotion and context is just noise, right?
Yes.
I mean, just an exercise in moving the pieces around the board in chess.
Well, one of the reasons I'm not that crazy about pop music is I don't find it very emotional. To me, rock and roll is emotionally a brick. It's just finish or fade out. I don't get that much emotionally out of it. It doesn't make me happy. It doesn't make me sad. I think I've come to feel about expression, by the way, that what I used to tell my students when they were doing, advanced theory graduate papers in graduate school, analytical papers, I said, I always want you to say what you think about this piece expressively. And these are Beethoven, these are mostly older pieces. And they were stunned by that because they'd always been told you don't do that in school. But I said, no, your sense of what the emotions of this piece have to do with your sense of it as a performer. And if you don't have a sense of that as a performer, you're not going to project the piece very well. And I don't think that most of them had ever been told that either. And I also said, if a room full of people, musicians or otherwise, agree on the emotional tone of a piece, that's interesting. And that tells you something about the piece. If they don't agree about it, that's equally interesting.
Sure.
It also tells you something about the piece. And I don't just mean inexpressive. I mean people getting different ideas. And I've come to feel expressively that the kind of big billboard expression, happy, sad, glad, mad, and that kind of thing, are people tend to agree about because every culture develops musical gestures to express sort of big emotions. But I think the subtleties of emotion is quite personal. And I think music is the most personal that way. But I'm no longer reluctant to say a piece is happy. That's fine. And it's not easy to write a happy piece. I tried once and failed.
It's like I look at like the opera composers writing comedies, and look, it took a Puccini. I think his hardest opera is going to be Schicchi, his only comedy. He was so good at writing tragedies that comedies are really hard. Yeah,
simplicity is hard. But again, I think the big blanket emotions we shouldn't be afraid of, and they are usually fairly clear. Beethoven, for example, I think wanted to be transparent emotionally. Mozart, that was not really Mozart's game. He's much more subtle than that, and he'll often hover in exquisite ways between emotions. He's not as hard on sleeve as other composers, but still, of course, it's emotional music. But I think perfection is emotional too. I can get tearful just over the sheer beauty and perfection of things. Beauty is another term that we're not supposed to use in school, but beauty is hard too, and beauty is a real thing. And dealing with Mozart, I was dealing with that all the time. What can you say? Because it's beautiful. It's extraordinarily beautiful, and that's not an easily achieved quality.
I think his intent was to write music that was beautiful to the ears immediately, but that's what they did. That was what he was. Yeah. He was just exceptional at it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's basically the secret of him. But there's another thing that occurred to me was I was on the last page of the Mozart. And that is, again, Beethoven was the first composer probably to be very aware that there is going to be a permanent repertoire and I'm going to be in it. In other words, what we call the Museum of Classical Music was starting to happen. Haydn and Mozart didn't think that way. I found critics who said about Mozart and Haydn, this music will live forever, but I never found Mozart or Haydn talking about that. Beethoven did. And that doesn't make you a better composer, it makes you a different kind of composer. And I ended up saying that Beethoven was writing for humanity in the past, and the present and the future. Mozart was writing for people, because Mozart's music was written for, all his chamber music was written for small performances in houses. Even a lot of orchestra pieces were played in private music rooms in those days. Or he was writing for publishers whom he knew personally, or performers he knew personally, and he would adapt the piece to those performers. He said, I want my piece of music to suit the performers like a well-made suit of clothes. So there's something very intimate in that sense about Mozart that is not true of Beethoven, and that doesn't make him better or worse, it just makes him different. And that's why I say Mozart wrote for people and mostly intimate settings. And a classic case of that, which is so wonderful, is the Kegelstadt Trio, which is this strange instrumentation for clarinet, viola, and piano. Well, the reason it's those instruments is because he wrote it for a party. The clarinet was his friend Anton Stadler, who was going to be at the party. He was going to play the viola part. He wrote it for himself. And this very talented teenage student of his was going to play the piano part, and it was her parents that were throwing the party. So you imagine there's this party, and there's a big room, and everybody's drinking and eating, and at some point somebody says, now we're going to hear Wolfgang's new trio that he wrote. My daughter's going to play the piano. And Wolfgang will handle the viola, and it's one of the great masterpieces of chamber music.
It's a snapshot of its time, right? It's
it really is.
I just love that kind of, it's like the amber that captures everything that's going on around it, and I think, and maybe that's why music will always be, Western, this culture we're so passionate about will always be there, because times just change. We capture different parts of the amber through different people's lens.
We do, and we have now. I think recordings are both bad and good. They're so easily available that they don't mean as much. When you had to go out and listen to a piece that you rarely got to hear, a Beethoven symphony, and pay money to hear it, and maybe you played it on the piano in the parlor, but you only a few times in your life are going to get to hear the whole incredible thing. It means so much more than if you just throw it on online or put on a CD.
And there's so many great recordings, but it's interesting. Like, I think that I've heard some people say that recordings have ruined, the musical experience. But that's
I think they've damaged it, but I don't think they've ruined it. What it's also made possible is that, in the first place, no music is going to die anymore, including, I hope, my own. It's going to be online or something somewhere. And of course, we have possibilities of listening that are more unimaginable 100 years ago. And there is something great about that. I mean, the first time I heard Balinese music was from high school students who showed up runaways literally showed up at our apartment in college, and one of them had one of the classic recordings of Balinese vocal. Of a Bulgarian, women's choir. The first time I heard Balinese music was a high school student of mine who walked in with a CD.
It opens up new avenues never imagined. Jan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always such a great, it's just wonderful to have these conversations with you. You're such a brilliant man, and you have so much insight into all music and all topics, and we could talk for another 6 hours, and I would be pretty excited.
Well, I wish I could do what you do, which is also be decent at performing it, but I never felt like as a conductor, I didn't have enough experience to do it, and you're the one who has to make it happen.
Well,
none of this means anything without you.
I did a little bit of composition, and then just enough to know that I love to recreate other people's art, and I love to find the structure in it, and and then I love to bring it to people and bring their best out through it. That's what I love personally.
Well, that's what Tramm said. He said, music is a republic. I write the stuff, you perform it, and people decide whether they're going to listen to it, and that's what music is. And I think that's great.
It's just so exciting to be a part of this and to speak with someone like you is an inspiration to me. So thank you.
Well, it's an inspiration to speak to performers too. I mean, I taught in a conservatory. I'd always thought I would teach in liberal arts, and I got to a conservatory. I realized this is where I want to be, because this is about making music, and you're about making music. And I taught theory and history to help people make music better as performers and composers. It's all.
Well, I can't wait to see what your music's going to be. Your next chapter of your music making is going to look like.
I'm interested to hear it too.
Time will tell. Time will tell.
So thanks so much. I really enjoy these. I hope it's not too rambling for people.
Never.
We sure do ramble, or I do.
That's exciting. Well, thank you so much, and continued success. And I can't wait to hear what that next chapter is going to look like.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Take care, Jason.
Thank you for joining us on Music Matters with Jason Tramm. Please remember to subscribe on YouTube and smash that bell icon, and share with your friends and family. And all the best. Keep music alive.
Peace.